Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt for the Remnant Forum. So yet another former advisor to Pope John Paul has come out this week with a dire warning about the situation in the Catholic Church at her highest levels. LifeSite News is reporting that Monsignor Michael Scoyens, a top advisor to Pope John Paul II, was also a close friend and confidant of Pope Benedict XVI, has issued a warning of, quote, a cabal undermining the Catholic Church with backing from within. Writes Scoyens, quote, the Synod on the Family has revealed a profound malaise in the Church, a crisis of growth without doubt, but also recurrent debates on the question of remarried, divorced persons, models for the family, the role of women, birth control, surrogate motherhood, homosexuality, and euthanasia. It is futile, says Scoyens, to close our eyes. The Church is challenged in its very foundations, end quote. Wonderful news, people are beginning to wake up. The same time this past week, our friends in London, England, announced that there's a group has formed there of Catholic academics, including a number of fellows from Oxford and pastors, who have submitted an appeal to Cardinal Angelo Sodano, Dean of the College of Cardinals in Rome, requesting that cardinals and Eastern Catholic patriarchs petition His Holiness Pope Francis to repudiate a list of erroneous propositions that can be drawn from a natural reading of the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. During the coming weeks, writes spokesman Dr. Joseph Shaw, this submission will be sent in various languages to every one of the cardinals and patriarchs, of whom there are 218 living at present. Describing the exhortation Amoris Laetitia as containing, quote, a number of statements that can be understood in a sense that is contrary to Catholic faith and morals, the signatories submitted, along with their appeal, a documented list of applicable theological censures specifying the nature and degree of the errors that could be attributed to Amoris Laetitia. Hallelujah, people are obviously waking up. And not just on the other side of the pond. Here at home, EWTN delivered this past week what I would consider a devastating blow to the ongoing scandal that is the pontificate of Pope Francis. On EWTN's June 23rd World Over with Raymond Arroyo, canon lawyer Father Gerald Murray, and the Catholic Thing's Robert Royal, these men reacted to Pope Francis's outrageous comments on invalid marriages, cohabitation, and priests somehow being like animals. They reacted to these statements in a way that sounded very similar to how we at the Remnant have been reacting to similar statements for a long time. Let's take a look at that video.
It's provisional. And because of this, the great majority of our sacramental marriages are null, because they say yes for the rest of their life, but they don't know what they are saying, because they have a different culture. They say it, they have goodwill, but they don't know. Father Gerald Murray, your reaction to that as a canonist. This is at odds with the traditional church teaching on marriage and the nature of that commitment and vow.
Yes, the great majority of Catholic marriages are not null. They're valid. For the Pope to say that is to express, I think, an unacceptable opinion. I regret he did it because it causes uncertainty among people now. Is my marriage valid? The Pope is not following the canonical precision that's present in the law about what it takes to get married. In order to be married validly, you simply have to know that this is a relationship between a man and a woman in view of having children, and by nature, it's a permanent relationship. You don't have to know all of the ups and downs that are facing you in married life. In fact, that's one of the things God prevents us from knowing, the future, which is a blessing.
Yeah, if we saw the future, you know, how many people would probably enter in? Who knows?
Exactly, but it's not impossible to get married, and in fact, the Pope has a very pessimistic view, I think, of this generation and their ability to understand the commitment of marriage. I strongly disagree with him, and I would love to have a conversation with him to say, Holy Father, there's more to this than you're saying.
Now, Robert Royal, some people are hearing what Father Jerry Murray is saying, and they might go, wait a minute, this is the Pope saying this. Who does Father Jerry Murray or Robert Royal or Raymond Royal think they are to even question this? You would say what?
Well, I would say that there's a departure from the tradition here. And so for him to say this is, I would even go a little bit further. I would say it's rather reckless, because at this moment in history, we all admit that there's a point to what he's saying, that in a way people who are married are in a very fragile situation. There are any number of influences in the culture that are mitigating factors. But to put this out there in such a broad way, and he initially said the vast majority of people are in invalid marriages. This, in a way, sends a paradoxical message that, if you're not happy or, you see somebody else you're interested in, there's a way out from this. And it just seems to me, and I think a lot of people, after hearing that, people who, like us, I think all three of us, respect the office of the Pope, respect the Holy Father as a person, hear that, and I think a line kind of was crossed here. You began to hear people say that it was preposterous. Edward Peters, the great American canon lawyer, said that it's preposterous to put forward that the vast majority, or even a large number of marriages are null because the culture is bad. Well, the early Christians were in a culture that was pretty sexually saturated, and marriage was sort of a very light thing, and yet
most of these people didn't read anything. They were illiterate.
And yet they were able to live a Christian life in a very paganized, masculine-dominated culture. So this is very troubling, and I think it's had a very widespread reaction against what he said.
So Chris Ferraro, who joins us from his home in Virginia. Chris, when high-profile conservatives and even neo-Catholics began to admit to what's happening, do you think it's safe for us finally to say and to admit that the wheels have come off Pope Francis's pontificate?
Well, the wheels were already off this unfortunate pontificate. I don't think we've ever seen anything in the living memory of the church, maybe not even in church history, like the response we're getting now from people of the so-called responsible mainstream. Academics submitting petitions to the College of Cardinals calling upon the Pope to correct his document because it contains serious errors against the faith. Somebody like Schuyans, an advisor to John Paul II and a confidant of Benedict XVI, the immediate predecessors of Francis, whose teaching, by the way, Francis has tossed into the waste bin of history, calling upon the church to recognize that we've reached a critical stage in the crisis such that the church is being challenged, and I'm quoting him, in its very foundations. Let me repeat that. The church is being challenged in its very foundations. This is a scholar and a confidant of the last two popes who would never have said anything like this unless the situation were of the utmost emergence in the church. This is unprecedented what's going on, and in a way it's good because God is drawing good out of evil the way he always does. This pope has overstepped his bounds repeatedly. This time he's gone too far, even for the most sober and responsible voices on the part of people who are still paying attention to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, you get the impression watching, the guys over at EWTN and so forth saying really what needs to be said, and hats off to them for doing so. But I think there's an increasing awareness among a large group of people now, of Catholics in the church, that when Francis goes after the Promethean, Neo-Pelagian, rigorous and so forth, he's not talking about traditionalists. He's talking about them. He's talking about all of us. Anybody who still believes that being a Catholic, for example, is a fairly important thing to do with respect to the salvation of souls, right? I mean, it's not just radical traditionalists.
Of course not. Only a few days ago, in one of his many exclusive interviews with journalists, he told an Argentinian journalist that with respect to the conservatives who opposed him at the synod, quote, they say no to everything. But I go forward and I don't look back over my shoulder. And that's an interesting phrase. They say no to everything. What does he mean by everything? What could he possibly mean when he says that his conservative opposition among the Synod Fathers says no to everything? Well, we know what he means by everything. Everything means institutionalizing the acceptance of what he calls insistently, with skeptical quotation marks, irregular unions or irregular relationships in the church, meaning adultery and fornication. This wayward pontiff, and he's so wayward that now even the most responsible mainstream people have to admit it and speak out against it, is actually demanding that the church overturn in practice something as basic as the negative precepts of the natural law. Thou shalt not commit adultery, being the foremost among them. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And now he's saying that the conservative opposition says no to everything. We all know what everything means at this point. Sex.
Yeah,
That's what
exactly.
this is all about. It's crazy.
He's such a liberal. He reminds me of those parents who say that we can't say no to our children. We can't say no to this. We have to give in. Yeah, it's just the old liberal mantra. You can't say no, 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 and that's how Pope Francis is running the show now. I want to get your. Actually, I'm having so much fun seeing things, seeing people, say things that you and I have been saying for 25 years. That I want to share another clip with you, and this is from that same The World Over with Raymond Arroyo, in which Robert Royal makes a point about Pope Francis. Not unlike the President of the United States, the Pope has to watch what he says, and this Pope is no longer doing that, apparently. I just want to take a brief look at that, and I want to get your reactions. Let's just take a look.
This was really a humdinger of a speech, Robert. In the middle of the talk, the Pope also made reference to priests who, in his estimation, in the Pope's recreation of events, he said if you have a couple who are not married and they bring their child to baptism, there are priests who won't baptize these children. They're animals, he said. These animals, he referred to them as. How do you process all this? How do you put this together? The Mueller joke, the animal comment, what's happening here?
Look, there are two people on the whole face of the earth who have to be careful about every word that they say. One is the President of the United States, because what he says or doesn't say could set off a nuclear war or, all sorts of cascading events. And the other is the Pope of Rome. And for some reason, the Holy Father seems to think that he can kind of freelance these things, especially, these are deep theological and moral theology questions and questions that have a long history in our church. And he says these things in a way that I think he thinks he's engaging people and that people need to be engaged in our world, but there also is this little bit of worry when he refers to the chief theologian, the chief official theologian in the church, and says, don't say this, because he knows that he's stepped into a field that has lots of technicalities and lots of unintended consequences. And for a pope to speak seemingly to demote marriage as it exists and to elevate cohabitation as it exists and on, this sends out shockwaves that are just incalculable.
So, looking at that, Chris, is Pope Francis playing this whole populist thing on purpose? Or, I'm sorry, is he somehow mentally challenged and doesn't understand that when he speaks this way, there are going to be serious ramifications around the world? What is it? What's going on?
I won't speculate on motives. I won't speculate on his subjective disposition. I won't comment on whether he's culpable for what he's doing. But I will say this. There is obviously, at this point, anyone can see this, serious personality issues at work. There's no question about it. There is a serious personality defect, according to which he himself says he is oblivious. He uses the Italian word that means oblivious to describe his own personality. And then he says, I'm oblivious and I just go ahead. That's what he said to some young people, a bunch of YouTubers that he invited to the Vatican back in May, that he's oblivious and that's just the way he is and he's just going to go ahead and do whatever he pleases. That's a kind of mania that is terrifying to see in a pope. He simply doesn't care what people think about what he says. He simply doesn't care about the impact of what he says. He's going to say whatever he pleases, whenever he pleases, wherever he pleases, and let the chips, or in this case, the marriages, fall where they will.
No, exactly right.
That's what we're dealing with here. And it's clearly a personality issue.
It really is. Over on the Remnant Newspaper's website, remnantnewspaper.com, Elizabeth Yore has done a presentation, an article on the situation with some of his appointments, and in particular, she's talking about people who in South America objected to some of the appointments that he made in terms of bishops and priests who were involved in the usual and covering them up. And he calls the people in this town in South America dumb. He says they're dumb. They're being led around by the nose. And you say, when is the last time? Can you imagine Pope Pius XII or Pius XI or any pope in history referring to members of his own flock as dumb and idiots that are just basically clueless and need to catch up? Since when is it okay for a pope to speak this way?
He doesn't speak like a pope. He doesn't act like a pope.
No.
And I return always to the telling example of his renewed passport. We have a passport with the name Jorge Mario Bergoglio in it. He renewed his passport under his old name, as if nothing has changed. And the passport photo is him wearing his pope outfit. So apparently he thinks this is just a job title. Nothing has to change. He has to remain just the same Jorge that he was in Argentina. shooting his mouth off at every opportunity. I hate to put it so crudely, but that's what he's doing. The man continuously shoots his mouth off in any location where he can get access to a microphone. And it's reached insane proportions now with these comments about people in Osorno, Chile being stupid or dumb. He calls priests who, in his mind, are not allowing the sacrament of baptism to be administered to children born out of wedlock. He calls them animals.
Yeah.
And there's a dispute over whether he meant that the people were treated like animals by these priests, whether he was calling the priests animals. No, he says in the Italian, they are animals.
Let me interrupt you.
Priests who supposedly deny baptism.
Let me interrupt you right there, because I think we should let, I didn't plan on running this clip, but let's take a look at Father Gerald Murray's response specifically to that, being called an animal by the Holy Father, and see the reaction a priest has to that, just briefly.
You know, on this animal question, for instance, you know, I checked, the Vatican transcript in Italian says, the Pope said, as if they were animals, referring to the children. The priests are treating them as if they were animals. The Pope actually said they were animals. He was referring to the priests.
The priests, not the children.
Yeah, not the children. And then immediately he starts going to critique of rigorism. Now, I happen to agree with him. Just because your child is born out of wedlock doesn't mean it should be denied baptism. In fact, I would favor baptizing almost all of the children.
Exactly.
Other factors have to enter into it. Is he going to be raised a Catholic and all this? But for the Pope to get really very personally angry at some priest, that's not good. I'm a priest. You know what? I make mistakes. I don't want to be called an animal if I make a mistake. I'd rather be called in and said, look, we do it this way. This is the reason. Let's change. I think he let his temper get him there, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, your heart goes out to these priests who are trying to deal with this. They're trying to be respectful, but oh my gosh. I mean, Chris, are we seeing something of a design flaw in the human element of the church, in that when you have, I'm sorry, this is beginning to reach maniacal proportions. When you have someone that really is beginning to act like a maniac in the chair of St. Peter, there's really nothing in the infrastructure to do anything about that, because they spent, I think, what in the past it would have been the faith of the people, the faith of the hierarchs, who would have prevented this, who would have stood up and objected. But they've spent the last 50, 60, 70 years so watering down that faith that really, Chris, there's nobody really out there who's going to stand up and stop this man. Francis knows it, and he's just going to forge ahead. I mean, it seems to me that's a little bit of a flaw in how things work when it gets to this point.
Well, Father Hunnick, on his excellent blog site, Mutual Enrichment, did a really exquisitely ironic piece making reference to the Pope's new handy-dandy bishop removal machine. His motu proprio, which basically says the bishops can be removed whenever I feel like it. That's what it boils down to. If you take away the canon law language, and essentially if the Pope thinks that the local bishop is harming his diocese in any way, materially, spiritually, morale, whatever, you can ask him to step down. And I think we're up to 7 bishops now, summarily removed on grounds of some involvement with some sort of scandal that pales in comparison to what's going on in the dioceses of liberal bishops. But all 7 of them have the same characteristics. They all have this in common. They're friendly to the traditional Mass. They're conservatives in questions of sexual morality, and they are critical of the trend of the church during this mercy offensive. So one by one, their heads are rolling under the bishop removal machine that he has just announced by way of motu proprio. So Father Hunnick says, gee, perhaps we need to look at an amendment to the Code of Canon Law that applies for a papal removal machine, some procedure to rescue us from this situation, which the Pope, ironically by his own authority, could create, without which we're helpless, because we have no right to depose a Roman pontiff. We can't even sit in judgment of him. We can't proclaim that he's a heretic, no matter how many things he says that are contrary to the faith. That judgment, even according to the writers on this, in the realm of theoretical canonical scenarios, such as St. Robert Bellarmine, has spoken perhaps of a council of cardinals getting together and pronouncing that the Pope, by his own words, has deposed himself, but that's never actually been tried. We don't have a procedure for dealing with this other than prayer and protest and petition.
Yeah.
The three
Yeah.
P's. Prayer, protest, and petition.
That's exactly right. I mean, there really is not. We really don't have any other recourse at this point. And some of the things that he's saying, Chris. I mean, I don't know if you have a note there, you can give me your comment on this too. But what he said earlier in the week, and I don't have the quote in front of me, where he actually compares, in Matthew, he compares our Lord's divine commission to go out and baptize all nations in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Ghost. He compares this to jihad, the same sort of militant conquest that Islam is so famous for. I mean, what do we do with this? To me, this is the last straw. This is unprecedented. What in the world do we do with this guy?
I look at a statement like that, and whether he intended it or not, as nothing short of ecclesiastical treason. I mean, again, this is someone who just basically shoots his mouth off. I'm sorry to put it so bluntly and so crudely, but that's what he's doing. You give him a microphone, he shoots his mouth off, and he scandalizes the church yet again, and he will not stop. That maybe is the last straw for a lot of people. Likening the divine commission to jihad, to the Islamic religion which has been spread by conquest and savage persecution from the moment of its inception, is just an outrage beyond outrages. Now he tried to nuance it a bit. He said that the divine commission could be interpreted in the sense of conquest. But even there he's being clever. What does he mean by conquest? Does he mean spiritual conquest? Is he playing a word game? Is he suggesting archly that the spiritual conquest that is involved in proclaiming the gospel is kind of sort of like jihad? Or is he making a literal comparison? Is he accusing the Christian Crusaders of being jihadists down through the centuries? We don't know, but that's the way it is with his comments.
Yeah, typical with Francis, and I think this is what Robert Royal was getting to the other night. I mean, he speaks this way and just kind of lets the sparks fly, lets the chips fall where they may. But I think he's not that dumb, too. I think he likes to say things that can really be, handed off to the left and they can run with that ball. I think he really enjoys doing that. And then he can stand back and say, whatever, I was just talking about, such and so. It's not the way I meant. But he's made this mistake so many times, mistake in quotes. I'm really not buying it anymore. I don't think it's a mistake. I think he does this on purpose. This is his thing. This is the casual Pope Frank who gets to say whatever he wants, which in and of itself is an assault on the papacy.
Well, again, we have a different kind of magisterium. I refer to it as the airplane magisterium. Whenever he gets on the airplane, we have magisterium. Whenever he speaks to a reporter, we have magisterium. That's what he says. He says in one of the quotes I have in an article I just did for you, he says, I'm constantly making comments and giving sermons. That's magisterium. Check it out, he says. So he wants us to check out his ever-expanding magisterium of off-the-cuff remarks. And I don't know how much time we have left, but the Shuyan's intervention, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, the Shuyan's intervention, it has to be the most decisive yet. If you read the text of that, it is absolutely devastating. He's talking there in terms of the mercy offensive that is going on right now with respect to the divorced and remarried and couples who simply cohabit. He's talking about the rise of neo-casuistry, this specious reasoning by which so-called moralists attempt to find clever exceptions to the moral law, just as they did in the time of Moses with the dispensation for divorce, which God permitted out of the hardness of their hearts. He speaks of neo-casuists. He goes on to say that there's a salami slicing strategy going on during and after the synod. He does everything but name Francis, but it's obvious who he's talking about. He says the first slice is that you present the teaching of Scripture on marriage and the church's doctrine. That's the good parts of AL, Amoris Laetitia. And then the second slice is that you talk about the difficulties in receiving the teaching. That's an Amoris Laetitia. And then the third slice, he says, is a question. Are the remarried, I'm quoting him directly, are the remarried divorced persons in a state of grave sin? Let us consider whether they're actually in a state of grave sin. And of course, Amoris Laetitia says, well, maybe not, probably not. We can just assume that they're not. And that's the can opener by which the whole can of worms is opened. And then the fourth slice, he says, is the entry onto the scene of the spiritual advisor, who is going to help the person who may not be subjectively guilty of living in adultery, even though objectively he is, to discern his situation. And I'm quoting from his intervention here. Compassion must take precedence over the assessment of actions which are objectively wrong. The advisor must be lenient and adapt to circumstances. That's the entire theme of Amoris Laetitia. It's the entire theme of this pontificate in general. And then he concludes with the fifth slice of salami. Each individual will be able to discern personally and with full freedom of thought what suits him best. That is an absolute disaster. It is the destruction in practice at the pastoral level of all the negative precepts of the natural law regarding sexually immoral behavior. And that is a theme of Amoris Laetitia. Let me quote, before I end this little bit, paragraph 303 of Amoris Laetitia, which speaks of how people who are trying to receive the church's teaching will give to God what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, while not yet fully the objective ideal. End quote. That's a recipe for the abandonment of all morality by reducing it to an objective ideal, and you do the best you can. That is exactly what Shurians is talking about. He doesn't say Francis is responsible for it, but obviously we know that he means Francis.
Yeah, no, that's it, and it's this pattern is going to continue. I guess the good news is there are an awful lot of people waking up, so we are out of time, but let's just close a little bit on kudos to John Rao and the whole Roman Forum team on that conference that they just concluded out there in Italy, which you and I were at. And that's basically an objection to the commemoration of the Protestant Revolt, which Francis has in store for us next year. And it was very encouraging. I'm sure you'll agree, and I'll give you the last word. It was so encouraging to see all these academics and Catholic activists from all over the world. And these are not all traditional Catholics. These are just Catholics who realize there's a huge crisis now that we need to confront. And we saw in Italy, they came together and they represent a lot of other folks who are also waking up. Last word to you. Good news, right? I mean, there is a serious wakening up here.
Very good news, but it seems that this Pope intends to try to top himself every week in comparison to the week before. So what we were talking about at this conference was the idea that Luther's notion of total depravity, where one who is justified is only given an external imputation of righteousness but remains totally depraved and is at the same time a sinner and justified. This notion has permeated the church. And what does Francis say during another one of his recent remarks? He says that when Luther went forth with his errors and preached them to the world, non aveva sbagliato. He was not wrong on justification. And Francis further said that we now agree with Protestants on justification. No, we don't. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith completely rejected key points of the worthless joint declaration between the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity, which I call the Pontifical Council for the Prevention of Christian Unity, and the World Lutheran Federation of Wacky Lutheran Sects. The CDF said, we cannot accept the idea that one is simultaneously justified and a sinner. The Church cannot accept the idea that there is no true inward regeneration. The Church cannot accept the idea that anything that would be hateful to God remains after baptism. And so this so-called convergence between the Lutheran churches and the Catholic Church is an illusion. And the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith made it clear, reciting the Council of Trent repeatedly, that the anathemas of Trent still apply to the key errors in Luther's doctrine. So here's the Pope overruling the CDF and telling us that Luther was right about the very foundation of his entire rebellion against the Catholic Church. And now he's going to Lund, Sweden to commemorate the life of the great heresiarch. It's unbelievable. And that's what we were preoccupied with at the conference. And I'm afraid it's just going to get worse. But again, the good thing, the theme of our little show here today, is the wheels are coming off the train. People are waking up. These antics are just crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I remember we used to conclude a lot of these episodes by saying, gee, when are people going to wake up? Well, hey, folks, we got some good news. Folks are finally waking up. Praise God. So, all right, Chris, great talking to you again. We'll do this again in a few days. We've got to catch up. We've been traveling a little bit and are behind schedule. So we promised the folks we're going to make this happen more often. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon. That'll do it for us, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael Matt, coming to you from the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, reminding you also that Pope Francis did not emerge from a vacuum. Everything that is happening with this pontificate was inevitable so long as the policies and the spirit of the Second Vatican Council were allowed to go along unchecked. Traditionalists have been trying to raise this alarm for 50, 60 years. And now everything that was predicted and warned against is coming true. And again, Francis did not invent any of this. He was inevitable. To that end, please stop by remnantnewspaper.com on a regular basis. We're now updating the site 2-3 times a day. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook. There's a lot going on, and we need your help. We need your help to kind of sustain the apostolate and what we're trying to do, and also to try to raise awareness wherever we possibly can about what is happening to the church that we all love. Thanks so much. Have a great day and enjoy the apocalypse.